Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. What follows, first, is a presentation by Christy Abizaid, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, which is then followed by a moderated discussion with Mark Pomar, a senior national security fellow at the Clements Center for National Security. Enjoy the conversation.
Thanks for being here. So Paul and I talked, we thought maybe I would wander aimlessly on stage for a couple minutes and give you a laydown of the global threat environment as we see it from the National Counterterrorism Center, just to start the conversation, and then really looking forward to the questions that he has, but more importantly, any questions that you all want to raise. You know, as Steve introduced, I lead the National Counterterrorism Center, and our job is to be the knowledge manager for the United States government on the global and international terrorism landscape. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how we communicate this effectively to senior policymakers. We also think about how we communicate this effectively to first responders, to the healthcare community, to any element of American society that could have to deal with the aftermath or be part of the prevention of a terrorist attack, particularly on U.S. soil, but against Americans overseas everywhere. And so in an era where counterterrorism is not the number one thing that we talk about from a national security perspective anymore, which is something we're very proud about, actually, I thought it'd be useful to spend a little bit of time spinning out how we do see the threat today, how it's evolved over time, and then have any kind of conversation you want to have after that. We describe the threat today to the United States homeland at its lowest point at any time since 9/11. We've described it that way for 2 years in a row. This makes probably the third time that we've said that publicly, and that is a really important testament to the counterterrorism community that we built after 9/11, and that has dealt with particular aspects of the counterterrorism challenge, especially Sunni violent jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, those various branches of ISIS, that has really done an incredible job of suppressing that threat. That has created a manifestation of the threat today, whether in the United States or in other parts of the West, that actually looks more like lone actor terrorism than the highly networked, highly hierarchical threat that Al-Qaeda, that bin Laden, that Zarqawi, that ISIS presented for so many years in the aftermath of 9/11. And this lone actor threat is very difficult to get ahead of. It's hard to be proactive and understand individual mindsets that might lead someone to mobilize to violence. And the fact that today's threat, the most lethal version of it, is presented by lone actors, often with less sophistication than we saw on 9/11, than we saw in some of the attacks after 9/11. That's a real credit to the suppressive effect that we have had as a United States government, as an international community, against that networked threat. But I want to be really clear, that networked threat is still something we're dealing with every day in today's environment. I get a morning brief. It is about terrorism challenges, terrorism reporting all over the world. And every day, we're dealing with some aspect of the challenge as it presents itself in today's manifestation. If I think about the threat warnings that have been public over the last 6 months, right? Maybe longer. There's a threat warning in South Africa to make sure civilians protect themselves in the event of terrorist planning. There's threat warning in Kenya. There's a disruption in Strasbourg. There's a new U.S. military footprint that is persistent in Somalia about the threat that al-Shabaab poses. There are constant attacks in Mali. There's the spread of ISIS networks into new territories that we haven't dealt with in the counterterrorism world in parts of Africa. There are threats posed by elements operating out of Afghanistan. The networked threat, the traditional Al-Qaeda, the traditional ISIS threat remains a problem, remains highly capable and requires an effective and sustainable counterterrorism enterprise to continue to combat. And we are very fortunate that we don't have to talk about that every day. Because if we're talking about it every day, it means that something else has slipped through the cracks, and we've got even more work to do. So as a counterterrorism professional who has worked some aspect of the terrorism challenge since 2002, since the summer of 2002, to see where we were in those days and where we've come in terms of the counterterrorism enterprise built to deal with the persistent threat, I'm just really proud about the fact that we have not had another attack on US soil at the scale of 9/11 in the years since. When we talk about the threat environment, we don't only talk about the lone actor threat. We don't only talk about the important networked threat that Al-Qaeda and that ISIS present, but we talk about sort of the diversity of today's threat environment relative to prior years, and we talk about the diffusion of that threat environment. So I want to break those down a little bit for you so you understand what we mean when we say that. So first of all, on the diversity of the threat, one, I said the most likely lethal attacks are going to happen from lone actors. Those lone actors are going to be motivated by a range of ideologies. We've talked a lot already about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but there are racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists that operate transnationally and globally. There are anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists. There are Iranian state agents and Iranian Shia proxies that operate in the Middle East, that operate here in the United States homeland, seeking revenge for the assassination of Soleimani, seeking to silence critics of the Iranian regime. We've got organizations that call themselves ISIS, but used to be Boko Haram. Right? We have the spread of terrorism in parts of the world that is really an exploitation of these underlying conditions that make situations ripe for terrorists. So a combination of transnational organized crime, governance challenges, corruption, climate change, all leading to an environment that terrorist groups can exploit and spread and recruit individuals to their cause, maybe not on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of needing to feed their family. And so these areas of global instability, these areas of fragility that create operating space for terrorist groups to thrive is a major challenge for us to understand in the National Counterterrorism Center. When I think about the early part of my career and where the center of gravity for the counterterrorism fight was squarely in the Middle East and in South Asia. Today's fight is spread to parts of Africa. It spans all the way from West Africa to Southeast Asia. And so when we talk about the diffusion of the threat, we're not dealing with a centrally led organization operating from the hinterlands of the AFPAC theater that is trying to find new and novel ways to conduct attacks, but that is highly networked, that is responsive to singular leadership direction. We're talking about sort of an atomization of the threat across territory that, as an intelligence leader, is a lot of the world to cover down on. Al-Qaeda does not just exist in the AFPAC theater. In fact, it basically doesn't exist in the AFPAC theater anymore. It exists in Yemen with the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It exists in Somalia with Al-Shabaab. It exists in Mali and in West Africa with JNIM and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. It is still present in parts of Syria, and the interconnectivity between these nodes of Al-Qaeda affiliates is a major transnational problem for us to understand and get ahead of. ISIS has that same sort of expansion of its brand, even as in Iraq and Syria, they are probably at their lowest level of capability we've seen since 2014 and their rise and return to Iraq and Syria, and the dominant presence that they and dominant threat that they presented in parts of Europe and parts of the United States. And as we look at sort of this diffuse ground that our terrorist adversaries are covering, and we think about what that requires of us as a counterterrorism community, at a time when counterterrorism isn't the point of our national security strategy, this is a really important time of transformation that as a leader in the counterterrorism enterprise, as a leader in the intelligence community, we're trying to take care of. And so I'll end on this note of transition. I know we'll talk about counterterrorism in the era of great power competition. But what's important is that we sustain the capability to continue to suppress the threat. We sustain the capability to understand how that threat is evolving, and we stay steps ahead of that evolution so we can continue to protect Americans and not allow the counterterrorism challenge to once again dominate our national security agenda. We've seen too many times, whether it's the attacks on 9/11, whether it's the fall of Mosul, too many times that the counterterrorism challenge swings us right back into a reactive foreign policy agenda that doesn't allow us to focus on great power competition, that doesn't allow us to rightly array resources against our near-peer competitor in China or Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. And so as we look across the counterterrorism landscape, understand how the challenge will continue to pose risk to the United States, we've got to be really smart as a whole of government leadership team about preserving the capability to deal with that threat and ensuring that the strategic surprise, the strategic distraction that can result from this terrible brand of political violence doesn't dominate our national security prioritization scheme again. So with that, why don't I stop there and we can have a conversation.
So thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Pope. I'm a professor at the OBJ School and a fellow of Clements and Strauss Centers. And I do want to go to a question about this topic of terrorism in this era of strategic competition. But I wanted to start, if it's okay with you, by summarize something I just recently read, okay? And it was, to give me a second to do this. The NSC's meeting on CT was tense. Some members believe we should prioritize our focus and our strategy vis-a-vis large state actor rivals. And that strategy was already beginning to bear fruit, and that a continued diversion of attention to terrorism was not in our interest. Some of those arguing for making terrorism a priority argued that our state actor rivals were exploiting terrorism for their own purposes, and that decreased access and stability in certain regions of the world hurt the United States and the West geopolitically more than it hurt those rivals. There were other debates having to do with law enforcement, military options, covert action tools, as well as how much collection and analytic attention we should put on the CT objective. And when I say this is recent, it's recent because I'm talking about an NSC meeting in 1984, and I read it in Dr. Will Lindbone's book, The Peacemaker, this morning. So I make this point, and I literally just happened to read it this morning, and I thought I was going to include it because I already used this phrase once for you today, but this isn't our first rodeo. In many ways, the post 9/11 period that many of the younger folks in particular grew up in was the anomaly, and we've actually returned to a management of terrorism within the context of our broader foreign policy and strategic objectives. But I would like to ask you to speak to how do we get the right level, how do we keep our eye on the ball while having these other priorities?
I love that. Quote from Will's book. I'm going to have to assign it as required reading for the National Counterterrorism Center going forward. You're welcome, Will. There you go. It's good to see you. I think this is the most important challenge for us in the counterterrorism community to manage successfully through. And the only way you do that is by proactively engaging in, one, understanding the resources that you have dedicated to any problem, being really transparent about where capability gaps are emerging because of a shift in collection resources or a change in the adversary's behavior that challenge your past ways of doing business. we talk a lot about the success of our counterterrorism community as a success that's been built on collaboration, transparency, and interdependencies. Now, when you are in an era of declining resources and a necessary reprioritization away from the counterterrorism fight, one agency's decision in an enterprise that is so highly interdependent can have knock-on second, third order effects that will debilitate us in a way that we didn't anticipate when saying, these collection resources should go in this direction, and all of a sudden something on border security doesn't work the way it used to. And unless you were transparent and obvious about how that thread was pulled, you wouldn't know what risk you were creating. And so for the role that we have in the National Counterterrorism Center to sort of look at the strategic landscape, not just of what the intelligence community is collecting, but how U.S. government resources are arrayed against the counterterrorism challenge, it's really important for us to create a managed process of resource allocation to the CT threat. And we're doing this, I think, in a way and in an era when, because you are dealing with scarcity, you are actually sort of filling a need that in a time when we were doing counterterrorism immediately post 9/11, and it was all resources that you need, no questions asked, right. You never really had to do. And right. So we're actually creating new systems of process management, governance of across U.S. government resources that today are critical to threat management going forward.
And you've already experienced some cuts, and I heard earlier today you were saying that you didn't think that because of these things we've learned and maybe efficiencies, you don't feel like it's affected the mission much. Yeah. Is that what you're saying so far? So far,
yeah. I mean, the counterterrorism community over the last, let's call it 5 years, has seen cuts in its mission. And I mean, some of those come from very reasonable places. We do not have a large footprint in Afghanistan today. And that Afghanistan footprint was really considered a critical and core CT mission. Those resources are gone. It's very expensive. And so, you look at that and you say, okay, well, we've repositioned away. What do we need to do to make up for the challenge of not being there physically? But that's a cost that you can bear, and it's, once confronted, a manageable challenge. And so, as we look across the places where you've seen resources shift away, or again, some of this is not about resources, but a change in the adversary, where we've seen changes in adversarial behavior that make our past way of operating no longer relevant. I look across that on at least a semi-annual basis, and we ask ourselves, how healthy are we as a counterterrorism enterprise? And we are still pretty healthy. Now, I would tell you, I am constantly asking the question of, when have we cut too deep? How do we know before we do it? And what do we do to engage with our congressional overseers? What do we do to engage with the policy community, with OMB, to make sure that we have what we need to continue to suppress the threat? And that is an ongoing conversation, and I think an important responsibility that we have as the counterterrorism community does nothing but counterterrorism, to facilitate the rest of the intelligence community, the rest of the national security structure to go do other things.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to something you emphasized a minute ago and ask you to kind of pull it out a little bit more for our audience. You were emphasizing the interagency collaboration, coordination. It's an enterprise that works on this. Tell us how that's managed. How do you work with the other actors in that area? And how important is it?
Blood, sweat, and tears, that's how it's managed. Yeah. Painful bureaucratic knife fights, but also, it's interesting when you take the the elements responsible for counterterrorism out of their agency context and bring them into a room with all of their colleagues that are also responsible for counterterrorism outcomes, whether operational, intelligence, or policy. That sort of ability to convene, that meeting of the minds for the counterterrorism enterprise to make decisions about where you need to focus your energy, to make decisions about what collection gaps you need to fill, to have the same sight picture on what the threat looks like today so you can posture for it tomorrow, that is the just the work and the kind of collaboration that has to happen, first of all, with the the agencies responsible for counterterrorism, but then lifting that out of just the counterterrorism context. So, the deputy director of CIA can see how the counterterrorism threat needs to be balanced against all of these priorities he's dealing with emerging technologies or the competition with China, and make sure that he's balancing appropriately. And in a time of great power competition where we know where we need to make up ground in terms of the amount of investment that we've had as a United States government, it is tempting to look at this counterterrorism bucket and say, well, let's just pull from there and move it to these other challenges. And what we've got to be really clear about is describing the persistence of the counterterrorism threat, being precise about what capability we need to deal with that threat, and then having a trade-off conversation of, well, if you take it from here, understand very clearly what risk we incur, and maybe that's the right decision, but let's at least surface that conversation to make sure that we're allocating resources effectively for whatever the kind of threat is we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, and I think your comment earlier about knock-on effects, I think when you begin to integrate, you start with sort of cooperation and then maybe coordination, and you move towards integration. Eventually, if you keep going, you end up at mutual dependence. And so then when people began to, I remember when I was deputy director of Counter-Terrorism Center, asking my boss if he knew how many NGA people we had there, and it was hundreds. So if NGA decided to decrease that mission, we would be, so it's a very important aspect of it. I don't want to say, I'm sorry,
can I just say one other thing? So we're talking a lot about sort of resource management. I know it's very exciting for all of you, but there's another aspect of thinking about great power competition and counterterrorism that's not about like the counterterrorism enterprise needing to protect against the threat, but it's actually about the usefulness of our counterterrorism capability for those countries that are also dealing with encroachment from our other competitors and adversaries. So, I've spent some time, though I want to spend more, on the continent of Africa in key CT hotspots. Those are really important counterterrorism priorities for us to manage, but they also sort of squarely intersect with priority on, China's investment in different countries, and understanding Wagner and where Wagner is, really gaining ground in parts of Africa. And so, the relationship we have with some of these countries is built on a common interest of counterterrorism, but it's highly relevant and very useful in the context of great power competition and how that relationship really pays dividends and in a very tangible way on their number one concern, which often is still counterterrorism, but that should be sort of leveraged and engaged on in an era of all sort of national security threats we're trying to protect.
Yeah, and our counterterrorism capabilities are kind of, nobody else has that, and I've found even countries that were not happy with us, we're quite happy to take threat information and help us help them. And that actually segues into the next question I was going to have, which is the national security strategy said that we're shifting from a U.S.-led and partner-enabled strategy to a partner-led and U.S.-enabled strategy. Mm-hmm. What does that actually mean in practical terms? It's a good turn of the phrase, but what does it mean?
I mean, I think in one way it means that you have less boots on the ground in some of these terrorism hotspots, right? We don't have a presence in Afghanistan, right? We have a managed and smaller footprint in Somalia than we've had in years past. But it also means that in West Africa, where we're kind of building from scratch, we've got to be thoughtful not about what direct U.S. capability needs to be deployed to the region, but what relationships we need to build, what capacity we need to enable of our partners in the area or our other foreign partners with capability in the area. So we've got a collective responsibility to deal with the CT threat.
And that really is an interesting question to me. Is we're talking about coordination on, say, threats, but you also have this capacity building, and it could be something specific like better border control, record keeping, or something like that. So that is an effort that a number of different agencies of the U.S. would be involved in that. Is that something that's specially managed in terms of like a working group or something to prioritize and talk about which agencies are going to take the lead with various countries or various agencies in countries and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this gets managed by a very capable National Security Council process where you have a CT directorate and the Homeland Security Advisor who also has responsibility for counterterrorism, really kind of pressure test whether the strategic goals we have in a particular region are going to be met by the level of investment that we as a United States government have in those areas. And where there might be a say-do gap, what do we do to make up for that in terms of renewed investment, higher level engagement, lots of different policy tools. Now, from an intelligence perspective, our job is to really accurately assess not just what the threat environment looks like, but what kind of partner capacity exists in the areas where we think it's most urgent. And where our partners are not yet capable, what long-term investment do we need to make? And where we don't have partners at all, what unilateral capability do we need to be able to bring to bear when the situation would require it?
So switching gears a little bit, in the absence of any kind of positive action by Congress, Section 702 of the FISA Act is set to expire at the end of the year, if I have that right. And how important is it that Congress reauthorize this tool, in your opinion?
It is critically important. I can speak about it from the counterterrorism perspective. In fact, it's a tool that was granted because of the counterterrorism agility that we needed as a United States government against what I have already described is still a persistent threat to us. It's also hugely relevant in the non-counterterrorism context. As we have sort of been able to leverage the tool, we've seen its usefulness in counterintelligence investigations. We've seen its usefulness in the cyber realm. We've seen its usefulness against China and other state actors that are of major concern. And so, and then when I think about it from a counterterrorism perspective, I think about the information that we derive from 702 as underpinning almost everything we do in the counterterrorism realm, whether that's high-value targeting operations, like the operation that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda in downtown Kabul, whether that's border security operations, whether that's understanding known and suspected terrorists who may be seeking to enter the United States, whether that's law enforcement disruptions and the kind of intelligence and liaison sharing partnerships that we have to have. The success of the United States communications industry has meant that we have a lot of bad actors traversing what the United States has built for the globe. And 702 allows us to target foreign adversaries.
With the warrant, right?
Well,
I mean, with not the adversaries, I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure that everybody in the audience knows what we're talking about with 702.
Yeah, it's not warrantless surveillance,
right.
if that's what
you're
referring to. Yeah, and it is. These are foreign targets. In my context, they are foreign terrorist targets that we need to be able to very quickly understand the context of their operating environment and determine how we can counter their plans against us. And so, it really is fundamental to everything we do in the counterterrorism world. And in an era of declining resources, in an era where we have fewer overseas boots on the ground, having this tool in our toolkit to be able to continue to understand what's happening in that threat environment is just critically important.
So another important issue, I think, is domestic terrorism. And we've already talked about this a little bit today, but I think the audience would be very interested in kind of where NCTC is now in the increase. There was a national security strategy released focused on domestic terrorism in the summer of 2021, I believe. And so where do you guys fit into that?
So first of all, for that intelligence assessment, the National Counterterrorism Center worked across its intelligence community counterparts, principally the FBI and DHS, to kind of bring the intelligence community view to the policy customer about what we as a country were dealing with.
So you produced the intel that supported that strategy development? We
co-authored the analysis that was then the underpinning of the White House strategy to counter domestic violent extremism. As we look at sort of the diverse and diffuse landscape and we see the ways in which Americans are most likely to be attacked, we see an increasing lethality of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists against American citizens here in the United States homeland. And so as the lead counterterrorism agency for the United States government, we have to understand that. Now, we understand that in collaboration with and in support of the lead homeland agencies, the FBI and DHS. And our role as the National Counterterrorism Center is what our role has always been, which is to focus on the foreign nexus, the transnational dynamics of that threat. And so as we look at collectives like the Terrorgram Collective, which is an online collective of elements that exist, yes, in the United States, but also in multiple countries overseas who talk about mobilization to violence and furtherance of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. That's a really important dynamic in today's landscape that not only affects us here in the United States homeland, but affects our partners in Brazil. We've seen it in Australia, Germany, UK, the Nordic countries. And it's really important that we have a dialogue and learn from our foreign counterparts, even as we in the United States are trying to deal with this.
I'd like to shift gears completely if I could. When I was a senior at the agency, I ran across a phenomenon quite often where a young person would come to me and say something. And now I've had students that graduated from here who kind of reported back the same thing. And that is this, that they studied international affairs or international regional studies or something. They wanted to work in the intelligence community. They got a job in the intelligence community. They became a collector, an analyst or something. They succeeded. And then they found themselves as managers and leaders. And they hadn't really thought about that. You lead a large organization. You came up doing analysis and things like that. And a lot of my students certainly have the potential to be doing great things someday. Yeah. How should they think about preparation for leadership and while they're still tending to whatever job they've been assigned?
Yeah, it's a great question. Leaders are everywhere in the intelligence community, and they exist at every grade and in every position. And one of the things that I really encourage is making sure that I don't care how new you are to the National Counterterrorism Center. I don't care whether you've been there forever but have chosen not to have a managerial responsibility. I don't care if you're actually a manager or a leader in our organization. You have a leadership responsibility just by dint of the fact that you are there and you are charged with the counterterrorism mission on behalf of the United States government. And so fundamentally coming into the job with a mindset of agency and leadership from whatever role you are playing, I think is essential. And then being kind of constant and continuous learners as you progress in your career. I learned a great deal from mentors, formal and informal. I learned a heck of a lot from the managers I hated working for, right? Like always sort of understanding what good leadership looks like, how to inspire your people, especially when things are hard and it feels like there's no way out. Everyone has an opportunity to lead from where they are. And so, come in with a mindset of where you can serve, what that service looks like in the context of your particular role, what you can learn from good, bad, and ugly leaders that you're surrounded by, and what that means for the formal or informal leadership role you want to take on as your career progresses. I started as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency and was fully committed to never, ever, 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 ever managing people across my career. And that all changed when I saw the effect of real leadership and I wanted to be a part of what made a team better. Despite what I thought I wanted to do, things change along the way if you just keep an open mind.
That's a great answer, and I love it. I actually jotted some notes down. It's very consistent with what I tell students that you.
Well, so that's why it's a great answer.
It is, exactly. That's why I agree with you. So it's good. But I try to tell them that you're a leader from day one. It's not when you get appointed into some title.
That's right.
And you also represent diversity as a new person. Maybe the only thing you can do from a leadership perspective is kind of question, well, why do we think that? Or whatever as an analyst. I remember one young man, I'll just say this very quickly, who I think you'll appreciate it, who called me and asked me this very question. And he is in charge of Ukrainian analysis in Jack Molesworth now.
Wow.
And he graduated from here after I arrived. So it's great. And I mentioned the word diversity in terms of diversity of thought. How important is diversity in the workplace in terms of thinking about the terrorism problem and being the kind of organizations that we need to be?
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation with your class just a little bit earlier, and I'll say what I said to them, which is diversity has to be baked into your theory of organizational effectiveness. And if you think about the comparative advantage we have as a country, the diversity that we have among our citizenry, the melting pot that is the United States, that is hugely beneficial to our ability to compete globally. It is hugely beneficial to the kind of innovation that is generated out of this country. And in the intelligence community or in any organization that you lead, if you're not valuing that, if you're not building a structure that empowers kind of diverse perspectives to emerge in any kind of analytic debate or in any kind of problem solving or innovation challenge, then you're not creating an effective organization. And there's a lot of really good academic leadership or literature that talks about how effective organizations, multinational companies, nonprofits, what have you, are more effective the more diverse they are, and the more they encourage the diversity of views to be surfaced and to allow employees to bring their whole selves to a job that can be grueling if you don't feel like you can do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's critically important. I think it's a comparative advantage and a national security advantage for us as a country, and as a leader in the intelligence community, I want to bring in as much diversity of talent, experience, perspective as I can, and I want to surface that to get after the challenge.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.